Welcome everybody to this live streamed Google production of day 2 of our conference, Challenging Patriarchy, New Spaces and Strategies for Advancing Gender Equality in Africa. And today we're starting with the second panel, which is entitled Challenging Patriarchy Through State Interventions and Gender Machineries. My name is Professor Sheila Meintjes, and I teach political studies at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. I'm a former commissioner in the Commission on Gender Equality in South Africa, and I am a proud member of the reference group for the Heinrich Böll Stiftung Engendering Leadership Project. I will provide a brief background to how globally we got to the idea of gender machineries, referring back to the UN meetings and the recognition that we needed some mechanism for promoting gender equality and gender equity in the state, what many of us call engendering equality. We will then turn to Professor Jacqueline Adhiambo Odwal, who is in Kenya, who will speak about the challenges to mainstreaming in government, but also perhaps talk a bit about its limitations. Professor Odwal is Associate Professor of Linguistics and African Languages from the University of Nairobi in Kenya. She's a policy advisor, consultant, and researcher with the Dialogue for Development Network, and she's also adjunct faculty at the United States International University in Nairobi. She has served at the United States International University and as permanent secretary in the Ministry of Gender, Children and Social Development in the Republic of Kenya, and as the Secretary for Children Affairs, and much besides. Mrs. Nkechi Onwukwe will join us then from Abuja in Nigeria. She is the Assistant Director at the Federal Ministry of Women Affairs, and her topic today will be on the challenges, opportunities, and limits of the ministry, and what roles there are for citizens to hold the ministry accountable. And finally, we are pleased to have Jennifer Williams with us, who is the Executive Director of the Women's Legal Centre here in Cape Town, South Africa, and she will speak about holding to account the independent constitutional body, the Commission for Gender Equality in South Africa, through monitoring its activities. Jennifer Williams is an attorney in South Africa, and she heads up the Women's Legal Centre, which is a non-profit, independently funded law centre started by a group of lawyers that seeks to achieve equality for women in South Africa. As access to justice is largely inaccessible to poor women, particularly black women, Women's Legal Centre plays an important role in litigating in their interest and providing them with access to free legal services. Let me begin then with a brief introduction to gender machineries. How did global acceptance occur for the idea of what has come to be seen as national gender machinery? That is the idea of what one might call gendering or engendering of the state by means of institutions that monitor, promote, and protect gender equality in state and society. These have acquired the rather clumsy term, national gender machinery. They come in a variety of forms: gender focal points in government departments, offices of the status of women attached to the executive, women's ministries, independent statutory bodies like the Equal Opportunity Commissions or Gender Commissions, or National Councils of Women, and so on. Their roles are to link civil society and the state, and to reflect on what policies or legislation might be needed to promote women's needs and interests. They have a checkered history of successes and failures, and perhaps one of the most damning is that their establishment has tended to undermine the vitality of civil society, and for them to become an elite project that does not reflect an appropriate evaluation of the needs and interests of the poorest and most vulnerable people in society. Instead, these institutions have become a stepping stone for women to participate in politics, to join a political elite in parliament and in government. Thus, these women then become subordinate to a political party and to the needs and interests of the political and economic classes in society. They cease being important interlocutors between the most vulnerable and the poorest in society. The story of the national gender machinery began really with the second wave of the women's movement in the 1960s, when women around the globe began to organize and articulate their objections to gender discrimination and women's subordination in society. These new women's movements, if you like, of the second wave, blamed patriarchy, a system that reflected male domination in every facet of life, public and private, where men's power was seen as normative and thus a very important aspect of why women were subordinated. This idea of patriarchy contrasts with the idea of masculinity and femininity, which really is about our identities as men and women. So it's important to distinguish between patriarchy as a system and our constructions as individuals, as men and women in society. The critique of patriarchy came from a whole variety of ideological perspectives, liberal, socialist, and even more radical perspectives in the women's movement. And each of these perspectives came up with different solutions on how to deal with patriarchy and what kinds of strategies that we ought to develop. But a strong global strand that emerged from the women's movement was one that suggested that states needed to find mechanisms to deal with women's subordination and secondary status. Thus, in 1975, in response to global women's movement demands, the United Nations began its decades-long global women's conferences that brought together governments and civil society to debate and tackle the problems that women faced around the globe. Starting in 1975 with the first conference in Mexico, and every 5 years thereafter, women's conferences have been held. The UN set up institutions to focus on women, and today UN Women is a very much respected body in the UN, incidentally headed by a former Deputy President of South Africa, Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, who is a pretty fearless feminist herself. Women back then, in the 1970s and 80s, lacked access to state parliament, to state institutions. They lacked presence in decision-making spaces like parliament, and they lacked the ability to influence policy and legislation. Today, nearly 40 years later, things have changed, but not nearly enough. Access, presence, and even influence are somewhat stronger in many countries, but some countries are still struggling for access to decision-making in their political arenas. So, while the proportion of women in politics has grown substantially in Africa, and we have achieved remarkable numbers in our parliamentary assemblies all over the continent, we still cannot claim that societies have transformed and that patriarchy doesn't still pervade state and society. Male norms are perhaps more transparent, and we understand a lot more about how patriarchy works. We know more about that than we did in the past. And we know, too, that state-driven transformation doesn't work because there is a lack of will on the one side. But perhaps more significant, we have come to understand that we've not been able to make sufficient progress because many of us who have thought and written about and have some influence even in what direction policy and action might move, we have not given enough weight to social transformation and the link between politics, culture, and social transformation. In our desire for representation, the institutionalization of gender procedures in the state, we have not worried enough about who should be representing and what agenda those representatives should be pushing. So with those first few introductory words, I would now like to turn to our first speaker on the panel, who is Professor Jacqueline Adhiambo Udwal, who is in Kenya.
Thank you, Sheila. And I would like, as I start, to acknowledge that your introduction truly has given me an entry point to speak to state interventions and gender equality in Kenya. As you rightly observed, in Kenya in 2015, after the elections, the Jubilee government, headed by President Uhuru Kenyatta, presented for the country and the region a landmark achievement by enabling the movement to get what they would have wished to see in a national machinery, having a Ministry of Devolution and Planning that is in the presidency and with the pronounced support and leadership of the president and the deputy president. As I speak today, therefore, I truly would like that the distinguished audience that is listening, we sort of ask ourselves questions regarding how far we have come from 1975. And the key question might be that if we get to the good practices or best practices of having the highest administrative office be at the helm of gender mainstreaming and state interventions, does this truly give us the outcomes? Do we begin to get the change that is in the life of women? Does it lead to a situation where policy and legislation translate into meaningful life experiences? I would like, as we reflect on this, to therefore draw attention on the following. One, that what seems to defeat patriarchy, what seems to defeat gender mainstreaming is patriarchy, I beg your pardon, and that we need first and foremost to look at the question of the national culture, the prevailing socio-cultural norms, and really the kind of conditions that obtain on the ground in the country where it is that the machinery is operating. In Kenya currently, the Ministry of Devolution and Planning has two state departments. The Department of Devolution, which has 3 directorates: the Devolution Directorate, Special Programs Directorate, and Arid Lands Development Directorate. The Department of Planning, which is the other state department, also has 3 directorates: Economic Development Directorate, the Directorate of Gender, our interest here today, and the Directorate of Youth. When we look at that, we can immediately see that there needs to be recognition that there is going to be very creative and clear thinking to ensure that we can connect from that highest office, the presidency, through to a directorate. Because we can see that the national machinery immediately presents some kind of contradiction, that the directorate is placed in the highest office, has access to decision making right to the top. But the question we might then need to ask is how the national and prevailing beliefs, customs, thinking of the citizenry is going to affect the delivery and outcome of services. And as I speak, therefore, I would like that we begin to link the kinds of responsibility and programs that have been given to the different divisions and link this to the lessons that we can learn, which could help us. The Directorate of Gender, as in turn, also has two divisions. Gender Mainstreaming Division that has very clearly spelled out responsibilities. One is responsibility for mainstreaming gender in ministries, departments, and agencies, as well as the counties. Two is to address the strategic plans that are very critical, not only in terms of looking at the work of the different ministries and departments, but to also look at the integrated county development plans. The division in terms of dealing with gender mainstreaming looks at the post-2015 agenda, seeks to ensure that there is cognizance and indeed connection with the medium-term expenditure framework, and look particularly at how to monitor the 30% affirmative action for gender-related policies and the production of sex disaggregated data. It, on the other hand, because we are aware that we have always seen that we have two dual approaches to gender equality, mainstreaming gender and the empowerment of women. And so we see that in the Directorate of Gender, the other division is the Socioeconomic Division that has responsibility for Uwezo Fund, a fund that is accessible all over the country to youth and to women. It also has responsibility for 30% preferential procurement provision for women. It has responsibility for the Women Enterprise Fund and for capacity building of women for 30% preferential procurement provision. And as I indicated, therefore, with this kind of very, if you like, clearly defined recommendations and good practices, we then can ask, how do we see patriarchy defeating these efforts that are here? And as I indicated earlier, the first for me really is for us in the learning to look at the systemic gender dominance, that we have a situation where systemic gender dominance persists, and it persists with limiting beliefs which claw back on the gains that have been made because of the expectations that present itself in the country. I think it is important for us to recognize that whereas we have made tremendous progress from 1975 to 2013, whereas in terms of government and state there is the stated commitment to gender mainstreaming, the public, the citizenry, is still really not at that level. The worldview, the expectations, the thinking of the very people who are to implement and to engage with the states, both those who are to be impacted, the women themselves, and those who are at the front line who are designing programs, are still at a level where they are in the pre-state, if you like, thinking. The second issue that I would want as we reflect to look at is how we're going to move from the best practices or good practices to outcomes. In other words, how do we go beyond gender mainstreaming and women's empowerment as a process that then becomes an end? How does the end become really the meaningful difference in the lives of women? And here I would draw attention to the very clear progress with regards to producing gender disaggregated data, with very clear commitment to ensuring that we have an engendered budget, with very clear indication of an envelope that will be coming from the government that supports gender mainstreaming, and indeed coming up with clear performance indicators through the performance contracting approach, and reporting to legislative bodies, and indeed looking at the international agreements. I think what learning we have is really that it is necessary with this kind of good practice and good provisions to incubate change, to be creative in a way that can allow creation of small niches where the gender directorate divisions and partners can innovate and take risks without threatening the status quo, particularly if we think that in the way that the state works and the structure that we talked about that moves from the Ministry of Devolution and Planning through to directorates and divisions might mean that we need to ask ourselves, as we produce the data and as we work through the directorate, this structure, what is the purpose and the mission that is seen to ensure that is clearly embraced? In other words, it is important to be clear that can we say that all the different officers, right from the Ministry of Devolution and Planning in the Directorate through to the counties, to the units that are delivering services, do they feel and recognize that they can creatively engage and just ensure that they pick on these good practices? A third area that I would seek to say that we can look at as we deal with state interventions is to look at the capacity of the national machinery to act as catalyst for gender mainstreaming in all sectors of development. I think it is important to recognize in Kenya that courtesy of the interest of the president himself in terms of leading, and therefore through the cabinet, all the cabinet secretaries by commitment and practice are expected to develop very clear gender mainstreaming plan for their respective sectors. Indeed, this is the thinking that shifted the government's orientation from having a standalone Ministry of Gender to getting to place the directorate in central planning, such as devolution, and to ensure that we did not have a situation where ministers were perhaps waiting or not happy that another minister was looking over their shoulders. The learning in this area that is useful for us is that despite this very useful framework, mainstreaming and women's empowerment is actually, to date, even with this arrangement, still, in my view, only tolerated and not celebrated. I think we find that the desired difference does not necessarily begin to be seen, because at some time, at some level, the high-level policy pronouncements and implementations of programs either are off target in the sense that the priority gaps have not really linked to the actual need, or are patronizing and in a way discount the expertise of actors, particularly the women's movement and a number of those with experience that have been accumulated over the years. And I think a key learning here is that laws and regulations, such as the 30% preferential procurement provision for women, provide for equal opportunity. However, they do not by themselves truly ensure equal access to that opportunity. And they cannot ensure that people, in this case women, who have been discriminated against, will immediately and automatically demonstrate the ability to take advantage of whatever access to opportunity may exist. And so we might need to ask ourselves, how sure are we, and how can we ensure that more women access this? I think a fourth area would be the structural and coordination arrangements for gender mainstreaming and women's empowerment. Given what I just indicated about the arrangement from the directorates to the division, I think it is useful for us to note that the Directorate of Gender needs to be purposeful about its coordination efforts, because a system with layers that goes to the county, that has partners from the civil society, from the UN, from development partners, from other agencies, can be overwhelmed with linkages, and this can impede innovation, can impede change efforts, can indeed impede clear monitoring. And so it's useful that it be purposeful. The fifth point that I would like to share concerns the framing and language use as a strategy to manage resistance in dismantling patriarchy. I would like that as we speak, we still recognize that reference to feminism and feminist action is still in some quarters, sometimes perhaps with regard to the state frontline actors themselves, treated with a bit of wariness. And so it would be useful to remember that framing does matter. How state officers in the Gender Directorate talk about their work, present the case for gender mainstreaming and women's empowerment, will bring other ministries, will bring communities, will bring actors, and will bring donors to the table or not. I conclude by coming to what, for me, with my background, having come through the women's movement, is the heart of the matter. The link of the national machineries with the women's movement, and the strategies to hold government accountable for mainstreaming and the advancement of women. It's my view, in my opinion, that the informal system of relationships in the national machineries finds both its origins and present function in the male culture and male experience. Its forms, its rules of behavior, its style of communication, and its mode of relationship therefore grows directly from the male development experience. And fortunately, there is a way in which, despite this, in a way, the civil society organizations that work in partnership with the state in some ways tend to blend and sometimes even lose their identity or voice as they sit round the table, which therefore means that they therefore join, in a way, the women who already, by the very nature of the informal system of the state, would not bring that distinctive voice of the women and would therefore not directly hold the state's interventions accountable. As I conclude, therefore, my greatest plea and, in a way, interest is to see how, in this way, we can revitalize the voice of the women's movement, because indeed in Kenya, the state has very clear laid out interventions. I just believe that the women's movement needs to engage, needs to hold it accountable, and ensure that it works. Thank you very much.